Hello thinking minds, how are you? We have arrived to the fourth episode of The Finding. You will find how the geometrical pattern was part of the ancient Egyptian culture. Before this, let me thank you for all your messages and approaches. So subscribe to the channel in order to share the finding with more and more people. As I was telling you, the geometrical pattern not only was an architectural tool, but a design tool applied in their false door cells, their coffins and their sacred texts. I also want to tell you that in the coming weeks you will see news on the channel, but I can't say more. I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll see you in the next episode of The Finding. The geometrical pattern, which the ancient Egyptians created in order to design the main proportions in their architecture, was the reflection and recreation of their cosmological and philosophical understanding with which they regarded their existence. In this chapter, we are going to deepen into how the geometrical pattern was taking root in the daily life of the ancient Egyptians as to the building process on their designs and, what's more, on their art and literature. The Egyptology has been able to undo the first steps the ancient architects followed to start any of their pharaohs' construction. The first of them is stretching the cord. This ritual, known has been gathered and represented since the origins of the kingdoms of the first pharaohs. It consisted of a cord cut by the goddess Sheshat on one side and the pharaoh himself on the other. This cord would fix the central linear axis of the temple, as well as its four corners. This ritual was perfectly compatible with the practical use of the geometrical pattern on the chosen land to build a royal temple or tomb. First of all, a stake was hammered on the axis of the temple that had been previously defined by the ritual of the stretching the cord, which would mark the center of alpha or beta rectangles. Secondly, helped with a cord that had been divided into cubits, multiples of 14, the radius of the circle of the geometrical pattern was defined. Later, a concentric proportion square was drawn, corresponding with the 11 and 14 rectangle. The junction of both figures delimited the linear and according to the architect's decision. This exercise in experimental archaeology, even being a reconstruction, was probably in practice with the ancient tools. As we have seen along the second chapter, the geometrical pattern developed at the same time when the first traces of the writing appeared. In fact, these first written proofs were found into the so well-known UJ tomb, situated on the pre-dynastic U cemetery, on the north from the tombs of the first pharaohs in Umelkap. This construction, dated about 300–2050 BC, was the tomb of the local king. It was previously the tomb of the first pharaoh Narmer, and all of it matching perfectly with the proportions of the geometrical pattern. The structure of the 9 small burial niches, all of them rounded by the 3 large rooms, is exactly 14 cubits and responds perfectly to the proportions of the geometrical pattern which was defined by the first intellectuals of those old times. It shows how that the geometrical pattern was not only an instrument on the architectural design, but with artistic purposes as well. Arriving the third dynasty, the closest circle of the pharaoh, even not belonging to the royal family, such as leaders, high officials, and senior military members, started adding the famous false door styles either at their outdoor structures with the shape of mastabas or at their chambers of chapels. These false doors meant the access of the deceased to the beyond. They used to be situated on the western side of the tomb, making a clear reference to the sunset. The Egyptology has never appreciated the weight of the geometry of these designs, considering they would respond to the artist's subjective criteria. In the third chapter, we just verify that the doors of the entrance pylons had the proportions of the alpha rectangle on some of the great temples in the ancient Egypt. Then, would it be possible that the geometrical pattern were the basis of the design of the false door styles, which had been built since the start of the third dynasty to the end of the culture in ancient Egypt? And indeed it was, as we can verify that the 1x2, beta, and alpha rectangles were used to mark out the main proportions which represented a significant symbolism. It was the door that joined the two spheres of existence, and the geometrical pattern did it. These are the roots of the geometrical pattern on the design of the false door steels. It is true that these false door steels had also strong artistic weight. Hieroglyphics and the offering tables testified it. These hieroglyphics were used to mark out the proportions of the steels on which scenes and texts would have also been gathered. The habit of drawing scenes framed into different decorative elements moved to coffins and papyrus texts throughout those times. The decorative elements on royal preserved coffins during the Middle Kingdom used the geometrical pattern to frame their most characteristic scenes. All of it has a lot of sense in their cultural tradition. The fact that the geometrical pattern presented art between the divine and the earthly life showed its use in the decoration of their coffins. The coffins were the place to shelter and preserve the best possible way the body that the deceased would use in the beyond. From this concept, the scribes used the geometrical pattern to frame on the papyrus the most relevant scenes taken from their religious texts, and so they made sure all their information would conveniently accompany their writing. Both alpha and beta rectangles were used on their most sacred texts to frame scenes in which kings and deities were represented in their daily life on altars, columns, and lintels, framed using the alpha and beta rectangle with their most sacred texts. It results clear and easy to understand that the geometrical pattern was created at the same time their writing and designing provoked this tool to be presented throughout their whole intellectual expression. The geometrical pattern was the way for them to be able to represent their life and surrounding world, and so this design would have taken part into everything they created in order to link themselves to that transcendental sphere, which could only be reached once left their physical existence. It seems clear that the geometrical pattern was part of the culture in the ancient Egypt from its beginning. One of the most notorious myths in ancient Egypt is the myth of Osiris. Osiris was killed by Seth, and Seth dismembered his body and spread it all over the country. Guess how many pieces he dismembered it into? 14 pieces! And there are more examples like this. The ancient Egypt was divided in 42 regions, 3 times the value of 14. They even had an ideal age to die, which was 110 years, making a clear reference to 10 times the value of 11. That's why it seems clear that the geometrical pattern was part in their culture, was part in their tradition.